Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining. This is hosted by Textile Exchange featuring YESS, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced, applying the OECD's due diligence guidance to the cotton sector. Please note that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on Textile Exchange's webinar archives within 24 hours. We will also be sending an e-blast out to all registered participants tomorrow, and you will be able to receive a copy of this recording as well as a copy of the presentation. In the question box, you will be able to submit any questions that you have. We will get to those at the end of the webinar. In case there isn't time to answer all questions, today's speakers will be able to email you back. So thank you for your cooperation with that. Currently, all participants are in listen-only mode, so please be aware of that. I'm now looking forward to introducing you to today's speakers. We have Patricia Gurewitz, the founder and director of the Responsible Sourcing Network. Liz is also the founder and director of As You Sow. She is a thought leader, engages corporations, and educates the investor community on the intersection of modern slavery, human rights benchmarking, and supply chains. She sits on advisory committees or working groups for Know the Chain, ICCR's Human Trafficking Group, Cotton Campaign, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and the Social and Labor Convergence Project. Patricia is leveraging her contributions to the development of Fair Trade USA's apparel and home goods standard and the conflict-free smelter program to develop the YESS initiatives. We also have Liz Muller, principal of Liz Muller and Partners and a consultant to the Responsible Sourcing Network. Liz has deep expertise developing systems that can be integrated into complex commodity supply chains. On behalf of Gap Inc., she acted as the first chairperson for the Better Cotton Initiative, BCI. She has advised cotton merchants, supported Cotton Council International by facilitating discussions on governance issues facing the cotton industry. Liz also has experience in developing and applying the OECD's due diligence framework in commodity supply chains. She led one of 3 original global firms that conducted audits of smelters under the Responsible Materials Initiative, that's the RMI, which was formerly the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, and now supports RMI by training auditors and helping smelters prepare for RMI audits. She is also a member of RMI's Standard Setting Working Group. Thank you both, Patricia and Liz, for joining. We're looking forward to hearing you, and we'll start the webinar right now.
Great. Thank you, Rita, for the introduction, and many thanks to Textile Exchange for hosting this webinar. During today's webinar, I will introduce YESS and explain what inspired us to create a due diligence standard for the cotton industry. Liz will follow with an in-depth example of how the OECD's due diligence guidance has been applied in the conflict minerals sector, including expectations and audits of smelters, which are akin to spinning mills in the cotton sector. I will then speak to how the due diligence guidance will be applied to cotton spinners through the YESS initiative and ways in which you and your organization can get involved with the development of YESS. We have a lot to go through, but we are planning on leaving 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If your question does not get answered during the webinar, we are happy to follow up afterwards. So what is the problem we are trying to address, and what is the solution that we are proposing? The problem is forced labor and worst forms of child labor in the cotton sector. Included in the nearly 25 million people trapped around the world as forced laborers are hundreds of thousands of adults and children forced to work in the cotton sector. Just to be clear with the types of exploitation I am talking about, the ILO's Convention 29 defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under a threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. It refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation or by more subtle means such as manipulated debt, retention of identity papers, or threats of denunciation to immigration authorities. and worst forms of child labor is defined by the ILO Convention 182 as it pertains to work which, by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out, is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. So I'm not talking about children helping their parents after school. I'm talking about work that jeopardizes the physical, mental, or moral well-being of a child, either because of its nature or because of the conditions in which it is carried out, which is referred to as hazardous work. The ILO further points out that carrying heavy loads, being exposed to hazardous substances such as pesticides, and working long hours fulfills the definition of the worst forms of child labor. Exact numbers of how many adults and children are being forced to or harmed while working in cotton fields are difficult to determine. What has been researched are the countries and regions of the world that have had incidences of forced labor and worst forms of child labor in their cotton sectors. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, or DOL, which has a list of goods produced with forced labor and child labor, it has 9 countries listed for having forced labor in their cotton production and 17 countries for child labor. The DOL issues another report called The Findings of Worst Forms of Child Labor, and in 2016, it listed 15 countries with worst forms of child labor in their cotton sectors. We at RSN are in the process of comparing these various reports together with additional research issued by the ILO to determine which countries and regions of the world have a high risk factor of forced labor and worst forms of child labor in their cotton sectors, and which regions are of low risk. In addition to the issue of forced labor and worst forms of child labor, RSN did research and asked a number of companies back when we first started hearing about forced and child labor in Uzbekistan's cotton sector. We surveyed 49 brands and retailers to learn what they were doing to address this problem. Results showed that over 80% of the brands and retailers did not audit their spinning mills in their supply chains. In discussions I've had with brand representatives over the years, we have learned that many brands have never even mapped the spinners in their supply chains and do not know where they are located. So we saw this as an opportunity to engage spinning mills. The solution that we are proposing is an implementation of the applicable components of the OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. I say applicable because the guidance encompasses many of the garment and footwear supply chains, and they do not all apply to addressing forced labor and worst forms of child labor in the cotton sector. The guidance for garment and footwear was launched in February 2017, and it follows other guidance documents issued by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, focused on agriculture, extractives, the financial sector, and others. The guidance documents were created to address harm in supply chains, just like forced labor, and are written to complement the UN's guiding principle on business and human rights. The garment and footwear guidance includes 6 steps, which are not necessarily linear. Embed policy and management systems, identify potential and actual harm, seize, prevent, and mitigate harm, track performance, communicate activities in progress, and enable remediation. A key component to all of OECD's guidance documents is that the due diligence framework applies to every tier of the supply chain. Every entity has a responsibility to apply these 6 steps of the framework. Since the due diligence approach may be new for some of you and is different than a typical social or environmental audit, I'm going to go over some of the basic terminology to make sure we're all on the same page. The overall concept of due diligence is acting with reasonable care and investigating an issue before making a decision. The OECD promotes a risk-based due diligence approach, which means applying different levels of due diligence proportionate to the risk faced by the company. More care will have to be given where there is greater exposure to harm. For example, if a company is sourcing cotton from one of the high-risk regions I mentioned earlier, the company will have to expend additional care to identify and have assurance that it is not sourcing cotton produced with forced labor or worst forms of child labor. We will speak later to how YESS will work with independent programs working in high-risk regions. Upstream companies are those involved in the harvesting, extraction, or the initial processing of raw materials, such as farmers, ginners, traders, spinners. Downstream companies are those that use processed materials in manufacturing or in a final product, such as textile and garment manufacturers, agents, brands, and retailers. Initial processors, spinners, for example, receive raw material from various regions and process that material into a product, such as yarn. It is the last place to trace the raw material to its origin. In some high-risk regions, ginners may also be mixing cotton harvested with different types of labor, both forced and voluntary, which Liz will address in her comments. A risk-based due diligence program allows for resources to be allocated where they are needed the most. They can alleviate the burden of audits for entities that consistently source from low-risk regions, and entities closest to production can promote the due diligence program to their suppliers. Due diligence framework is not about checking a box on an audit tool. It is about empowering the actors closest to where any harm is occurring so they can investigate the issue and make an appropriate decision. So quickly, I will introduce YESS, and then we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. What we are doing is taking the OECD's due diligence guidance and applying it to the cotton sector with yarn spinners. And that is YESS, yarn ethically and sustainably sourced. Why do we need YESS now? Well, there's a lot of legislation that has been happening regarding modern slavery and forced labor, due diligence in the Netherlands, Australia, France, California, all have legislation just in the last couple of years focused on forced labor and modern slavery. Sustainable Development Goal 8 on decent work also has target 8.7 and the Alliance of 8.7, which is focused on eradicating all forms of forced labor by 2025. There's been a number of different pressures on companies to improve their supply chains, as well as more and more companies have been proactive with their commitments to sustainable cotton, human rights, and increasing their focus on transparency. There's also been more modern slavery covered lately in the media. But technology has given us a number of great solutions. A lot of traceability software has come into existence from conflict mineral needs, as well as blockchain is being promoted as a solution to having more transparency and accountability in the supply chain. All of this is contributing to momentum of why we think, yes, it is time for it now. So the mission of YESS is to create an industry-wide due diligence program for yarn spinning mills to eliminate from their supply chains cotton produced with forced labor and worst forms of child labor. Some people might ask, if you want to address forced labor on the ground, you should be on the ground. But as I mentioned before, yarn spinners have that visibility to where the cotton originates. They also have the ability to choose where they want to source cotton from. And they're closest to where the production is happening, so they can ask and request information on the labor practices of how yarn is being harvested and produced. Spinners are considered a crucial choke point because they can mix cotton together from high risk and low risk region. After the cotton becomes yarn or textile, it is nearly impossible to know from where it originated and how it was produced. Plus, low-risk regions don't need additional due diligence, only high-risk regions do. So that is where we want to focus our attention and resources, on those high-risk regions. Now I will turn it over to Liz to give details on expectations and how due diligence has been implemented in the middle of the supply chain.
Great, thank you, Patricia, for such a great introduction. I will now present an overview of a program based on OECD's due diligence guidelines and frameworks that has been successfully implemented in the minerals sector. Just for some background, conflict minerals are minerals like tin or gold that financed armed groups that commit human rights abuses in areas of conflict. As I present how the electronic industry has implemented their program to avoid conflict minerals in their supply chain, I will often reference minerals and cotton are similar, or where they are similar. The next slide will illustrate this. This is what I call a supply web. Supply webs are not a linear chain. This represents a commodity supply chain, which are much more complicated than a linear chain you often see in presentations. In this reality, it is difficult to trace a material through this complex supply web from raw material to final product. YESS and the Conflict Minerals Program flips this on its head by keeping an undesired product out of the supply chain in the first place. In the next slide, I will show just a very simplified representation of that supply chain, and showing that the YESS program and the Conflict Minerals Program focuses on that initial processor, as Patricia explained, as a real gatekeeper or a choke point in the supply chain. I do want to make a special note for the case of cotton. Under YESS, often we recognize that cotton is often mixed at the gin from numerous farmers. However, when those gins are sourcing from low-risk countries, and they do source regionally, we would not need to differentiate these different sources or the farms, and therefore an assessment of, or even identifying the gin would not be necessary in these low-risk regions or countries. However, in high-risk countries of origin, ginners would need to be assessed to ensure they are only sourcing from farms that qualify as forced labor or worst forms of child labor free. In the minerals program, they rely on third parties with expertise in those high-risk regions to conduct these assessments. YESS would take the same approach, leveraging the work of farm-level programs such as Better Cotton Initiative, Cotton Made in Africa, and others. So moving on to the expectations. Again, as Patricia mentioned, due diligence is a very important, and it's the core principle of this program. For the initial processors, I'd like to present their expectations and requirements in 5 categories. The first is establishing a policy to guide the various responsible sourcing activities. Having a written policy that is publicly available is just one mandatory requirement, at least under the Conflict Minerals Program. It must be supported by procedures and aligned across various departments in the company. For example, procurement, receiving, and production. It should also be communicated to suppliers. The second important requirement is identifying all the suppliers and raw material origins in their supply chains and conducting due diligence of suppliers through a Know Your Counterparty or KYC process. This would serve as a first step to understanding where risks may exist in their supply chain. This would allow them to understand better where they should dedicate resources to investigate further, engage with stakeholders who may pose risks, or if risks posed are significant enough to terminate relationship with high-risk suppliers. Third, a smelter or spinner must also have a material management system in place that accounts for the flow of material upon receipt at the facility, through processing, and to the shipment of final product. The initial processor must show how their material management system works and ensure that all material is accounted for by completing a mass balance calculation. The fourth is a critical process of the due diligence program is to identify, prevent, and mitigate risks that may exist in a smelter or spinner supply chain. In the case of cotton, YESS would identify the high-risk countries, as Patricia mentioned earlier. The spinner would need to identify cotton lint sourced from high-risk countries and take appropriate measures to avoid purchasing cotton from those high-risk sources or work with others to mitigate the risk in those regions. And lastly, initial processors are required to monitor their performance and publicly report progress. Let's discuss these in a bit more detail. For the policy, there is the intent, the implementation, and impact. The intent, the policy is stated in procedures and communicated to suppliers. The policy content should align with the goals of the standard and overall program. The policy must be implemented. Placing policy language in contracts or on a company website is not enough. As I mentioned, the smelter or spinner must train relevant employees on the policy and procedures and actions they must take in their daily operations to uphold the policy. Lastly, they should have a system in place to ensure the policy is implemented. This can be done by checking transaction level documents, but it can also be done through receiving and responding to feedback from employees or stakeholders through grievance mechanisms. And now just moving on, for the supply chain mapping. Mapping a supply chain involves understanding your suppliers, raw materials, and its origin, as well as the transportation routes. This is I think most people are familiar with this, but it is important to understand where these entities exist and the origins, as well as the transportation as it relates to the high-risk areas. Next slide. Once a processor identifies its suppliers, it must conduct due diligence on them. The first check is who the suppliers are and why are they supplying the material? Does it make sense? If no abnormalities are identified in the KYC process, there is no reason to suspect the supplier is illegitimate. Additional due diligence is not warranted. However, if discrepancies or abnormalities were identified, for example, a trader supplying from a brand new region, but without detailed documentation, additional due diligence would be warranted. Ensuring the supplier understands the policy and documentation expectations is important. And again, this should be integrated into daily operations. Next slide. The material management system is another very important component of a due diligence program. The initial processor or spinner must have a system to validate the material as it is stated upon the receipt to the spinner. So they have to confirm that it is as it is stated. This would be to check the documentation for not only origin, but the weight and characteristics that may be unique to a particular region. Also, an initial processor must have a system to assign unique lot numbers, register the material in a management system, and reconcile all material throughout their processes from receipt of the raw material to sale of final product, including production losses, such as combing or carding waste. Next, I will go into the mass balance in that calculation. So as I mentioned, the initial processor must also demonstrate that all material received, processed, and sold during the audit period have been reconciled and accounted for. Basically, they must demonstrate that the total inputs, the receipts, and the raw material, along with the product and work in process that is present on the first day of the audit, minus outputs, sales, and the inventory on the last day of the audit, can be reconciled. There will be a small percentage of production loss that would be allowed in this calculation. For conflict minerals, it is a 10% production loss because that is the industry standard. And moving on to the risk identification, prevention, and mitigation. To identify risks in its supply chain, a spinner would need to evaluate their suppliers and material against the countries YESS identifies as high risk. They should also assess the transportation routes. Do they make sense for the stated origin? Were there any opportunities for repackaging or relabeling material during transit? Any discrepancies or abnormalities would trigger the need to conduct additional due diligence. Also, production levels, and in cotton, harvest season, in a country of origin should make sense. If risks are identified, steps should be taken to prevent and mitigate the risks. For example, avoiding or engaging with high-risk region suppliers or supporting farm-level programs in those high-risk regions. And then the next slide, I will discuss how the risk-based approach applies to the transaction requirements when checking the origin of the material. This, you can see from this slide that the documentation required to validate origins differs between low and high risk origins. Material originating from low risk origins would only need documentation that validated came from that general region or a country. Material originating from a high risk origin would require additional documents, both to add more assurance through additional data points, but also more documents that show additional detail as to which specific cotton farm or gin from which the material originated. I should also note that in the minerals program, only a sample of the low-risk sourced material would need to be inspected, 10% of transactions. However, each and every transaction from a high-risk source would need to be inspected, again, applying the risk-based approach. So now I will discuss a little bit more detail of how one checks these documents. And in the next slide, what I have coined is the gates, weights, and dates approach. I've referred to this because these are very important data points that allow triangulation of various documents. The gate is the country of origin, the weight of the material, and then the date aligns with the reasonable period of material receipt and transport. And of course, credible documentation is always important. So let's look in the next slide at how to apply this approach. This is an example of a bill of lading, and I like bill of ladings a lot because they are a standardized form that contains all of the information I'm looking for, the gates, dates, and weights, and it is completed by an independent third party. However, a bill of lading alone is not sufficient. In the next slide, I show how we align this with additional documents. Having 3 or more data points to triangulate, Patricia, if we can get the next slide. Having 3 or more points to triangulate a shipment gives us confidence that the documents align and represent the transaction that it is claiming to do so. For example, a purchase order and a bill of lading and an export document should all align. The dates, weights, and gates should all match each other or be aligned with one another. In addition, as I mentioned a few slides earlier, material from high-risk sources should have additional documents, such as in the mining, the minerals world, it would be a mine certificate or a mine license along with transportation from every step from the mine to the port, not just the bill of lading across those seas, if you would. In the next slide, I am going to just touch on an important final thought and requirement for these programs. We know that, and we are not expecting initial processors to have a perfect program from the get-go. but they should be continuously improving their program. This is a very important aspect of the minerals program, especially as it evolves. The initial processor should have processes to assess conformance with their policy and procedures, build in ongoing monitoring opportunities, including and not limited to grievance mechanisms, and undergo an annual audit, which would be conducted by YESS or through the YESS program. As I mentioned earlier, processors should also report out on their progress. I hope this overview of how OECD's framework was applied to minerals and how it will be applied to cotton through YESS was helpful. There will be time at the end to answer any questions you may have, but before taking questions, Patricia will provide an update on YESS activities and how you can get involved.
Hi, Liz. Thank you. And I just want to double check and make sure that you can hear me okay, because I'm switching to my audio. Liz, can you confirm that you're hearing me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Great, thank you. And apologies earlier on for any difficulty that you all had for hearing me. Now I'm going to describe how YESS plans to implement due diligence in the cotton industry to address forced labor and worse forms of child labor. We talked earlier about the OECD due diligence guidance for the garment and footwear sector, and using that guidance, we set about and are still in process of identifying high-risk regions. We're researching industry standards and practices, and in the process of developing an audit standard, trainings, checklists, and other tools to be able to train the spinners. As Liz talked about expectations and process that was done with the conflict minerals smelters, we'll be taking the same approach with yarn spinners. We are also looking to coordinate all the existing sustainable cotton and apparel initiatives with what we are doing and talking to them about how we can integrate our activities. It's also very important for us to recognize the various farm-level farm-level programs such as Better Cotton Initiative, Cotton Made in Africa, Cotton Connect, Fair Trade, and other credible programs that have ethical and labor conditions and human rights embedded into them. This is important because we are not planning on sending armies of auditors and people out to the cotton fields. We're relying on all the wonderful projects that already exist. We know that monitoring and traceability is already happening, and this will be really important for us to look and see where those programs exist in the high-risk areas. This will give spinners the assurance that cotton coming from high-risk regions is not contributing to forced labor or worse forms of child labor. We also need to ensure that the information that we're verifying with spinners is then integrated with a variety of the projects happening with brands and clothing manufacturers regarding the social and labor convergence and other efforts of seeing where manufacturers are also asking where their textile, yarn, and cotton is all coming from. To identify all the yarn spinners, there'll be some need to do industry surveys to know exactly where they're all located and what they're processing. We've done a lot of groundwork with YESS over the last couple of years. Many of you, I'm sure, are signatories to our cotton pledge, not to source Uzbek cotton until the different labor and child labor abuse stops there completely. I mentioned earlier our cotton sourcing snapshot report, surveying companies on the actions they're taking. We did a feasibility study a couple of years ago looking at the interest by industry to implement an industry-wide project like YESS. And we have joined the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, contributing to the Convergence Project. We gave input to the OECD due diligence guidance, and we're now going to be joining BCI this year. We launched YESS website or a page of our website at the end of 2016. And this year, I'm very happy to announce, actually it was 2017, that the Disney company's supply chain investment project invested in YESS. We have a multi-stakeholder working group that has monthly calls. In 2017, Liz and I had the opportunity to visit a number of spinning facilities in India, Turkey, and Bangladesh. We currently have a spinner survey that complements the field research that we did, and we're drafting the YESS standard and supporting documents, and we'll be looking to pilot that later this year. In regards to how you can get involved, we have a YESS statement of support on our website, and we are looking for more members, especially brand members, to join our working group. I have the link up here, and we'll circulate it with our follow-up of the spinner survey, and this is to complement the field research to have a complete understanding of all the documentation and processes across the industry, as well as what are typical for different countries. We're looking for public feedback once we have our standard drafted and distributed, which will be happening during Q1 and Q2 of this year, as well as we're looking for a variety of spinning mills in different locations for where we can pilot the standard. With that, I will stop. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and I'll hand it back to Rita to manage that.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz and Patricia. It was a really great presentation. A few questions for you, and anyone who is still on, please feel free to type in a question in the question box if you have anything that you'd like to be answered. Okay, I'll start with this one. So even though you triangulate the paperwork, couldn't there still be a way to falsify cotton labels and documentation?
I'll take this question. This is Liz. Certainly, this is usually the first question. Yes, however, that's why I really support the triangulation approach. And as I mentioned during the presentation, Bill of Ladings are a standard document that's used in the industry, and quite often, I think nearly always, completed by a third party, independent third party. So I do really like those documents, transportation and documents in general. But so you do have to take a look at all of the data points. And if there is a suspicion of any disingenuine documents, that's when you dig deeper. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. I'll take another one. Are high-risk sources specifically defined as any of the countries listed in the DOL forced and child labor reports, or would YESS define this differently?
This is Patricia. I'll start, and then if Liz wants to add on. It is a question that has come up before, and the way the OECD addresses it is they have a certain level of expectation on that initial processor for them to understand where the high-risk regions are. However, we do, especially in the beginning, think that it's a lot of effort and work for the spinning mills to do all the research and to understand high-risk regions. So we are relying on those Department of Labor reports on forced labor and worst forms of child labor, as well as the ILO has a number of documentation reports looking at the application of standards for different countries. And so we're looking to do that initial research, at least in the beginning. And we think as the demand for that type of information and really understanding where those risks are, as that demand continues to grow, the research will be there. One thing I do want to point out is that there are some, the way you could look at countries is that some we know there's forced labor throughout the entire country in their cotton sectors, such as Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. But there's other countries like Pakistan, China, Burkina Faso, where there's cotton harvested with both high risk as well as voluntary. And there it's going to be important to start understanding which regions of the country have higher risk of forced labor and worse forms of child labor, and under what conditions, if it's machine harvested, or are there other ways to know that there's low risk. And that's where it's really important to have the on-the-ground projects and initiatives giving further information or being able to do the trainings with the farmers, et cetera, so that we know there's low risk of labor abuse.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Patricia. We have another question. Do you have any examples of companies that have completed mapping of their entire supply chain?
This is Liz. I can share from a conflict minerals standpoint. I think I don't know off the top of my head for the cotton. I do know some companies that are aware of the spinning mills that they source from. I know IKEA is very involved in that, and many of the other brands are identifying their spinners. I will say that I had the opportunity to support a electronics industry member, a brand, managing their conflict minerals program back to the spinners. So they work with each and every one of their suppliers to identify and confirm that the minerals were being sourced only from smelters that were in conformance with the program. So it would be a brand, if in the cotton world, it would be a brand working with their manufacturers and mills to identify and confirm that all of their cotton is being sourced from the spinners that have gone through the YESS program and been found in conformance. I will not pretend that that was an easy exercise. It's massively complicated. In the minerals world or in the electronics industry, I've heard that there could be up to 20,000 suppliers in a given supply chain. So it is challenging, but they are doing it.
This is Patricia. The other thing that I will add, and I mean, there are a few other companies that I've heard of, Patagonia and Eileen Fisher, I know are both doing a lot of work to try to identify all the way to farm level. If they're 100% organic and you have that additional traceability opportunity there, it makes it quite a lot easier. If you don't have that, or if you don't know where your textile manufacturers are getting their yarn, it makes it much more difficult. But another big difference I want to point out with this due diligence approach versus a segregated traceability approach is that you're looking at the documentation that follows the product. So as many of you, I'm sure, are familiar due to all the organic standards, is that you could request, if necessary, the documentation and paperwork of certification, organic certification from the farmer through the GODS program. Then the spinner and the textile manufacturers have access to that paperwork. We're not promoting a product traceability approach. It's more of verifying each entity in the supply chain. And once you look at the overall entity and have assurance that that spinner has the management processes in place and puts in the process for assuring that they are not bringing in any cotton harvested with forced or child labor. Maybe some of it is conventional, maybe some of it is better cotton, etc. But you know that all the cotton coming in does not have that forced or child labor component, and therefore it minimizes the amount of paperwork and management of that each individual bolt of fabric or cone of yarn.
Okay. So have you had input from BCI, Cotton Connect, et cetera yet? And if so, what are their thoughts?
I'll start and see if Liz wants to add anything else, but we have started to have the various meetings. We were at BCI's office last fall and finding out more about their processes and the interaction that they're having with their spinning facilities. Since BCI and Cotton Connect, those conversations are also starting to happen, though we're in process of developing them further. The focus is on the farmers and going from farmer to ginner, and we know that BCI has done a lot of work working with ginners and ensuring that ginners are only packaging up segregated bales, which is really great because then you know all the cotton in that one bale is coming from BCI farmers. And then the process of their traceability program, their tracking of those better cotton credits through their system. And there isn't a ton of work being done with spinning facilities other than how it relates to using their tracker and the better cotton credit units. So we see that our program will complement theirs in doing more training with the spinners, educating them on where there's risk, as well as our program promotes using Better Cotton or Cotton Connect and others on the ground because we want to have those assurances in high-risk countries that the farms are not using any type of forced labor or worse forms of child labor.
And I'll just add that I think the beauty of the YESS program is that it is positioned very well to complement all of these other efforts. So the focus, again, would be at that spinner and to move across the entire sector. So basically enter in at that middle of the supply chain and move across the supply chain and bring on board as many spinners as possible. And then again, they work as a gatekeeper. And the goal also is to reduce audit fatigue at this level. And YESS would be designed closely with these other farm level assessment programs so that when we are in the spinners reviewing their management systems, reviewing their procedures, and reviewing their documents, we are able to incorporate the requirements or the expectations of BCI, CMIA, Cotton Connect, and others into that audit process. And therefore, I believe we would be supporting and strengthening the credibility of all of those programs. But more importantly, we would be helping the spinners understand and really take ownership of their responsibilities as it relates to sourcing any forms of cotton. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely, and this is a question that kind of piggybacks to that. If you will be working with spinners that create yarn made of cotton and non-cotton materials, or cotton spinners only?
Most spinners these days will have blended material. We in YESS is focused on cotton at this moment. However, as I had shared the mass balance equation, they do need to account, and I had highlighted the cotton, but because they will be weaving in other materials on occasion into their yarn, we would need to understand the volumes of the other material as it relates to that mass balance and accounting for all of their fibers or filaments that go into the final yarn. However, at this point, we are not interested in conducting due diligence down to the origin and conditions and the production or manufacturing of the non-cotton fibers or filaments.
Okay. Could you please share more information on how you certify and select spinners themselves in terms of compliance to national and international legislation?
great question. I can take a stab at it and go from there. And I'm assuming on when, you know, national and international legislation, although almost every country I'm aware of has laws in place not to have any forced labor and, you know, a variety of approaches towards child labor, but they're not always enforced. And so we are looking at more of the international legislation and legislation like I mentioned on one of my slides. What we can say from the work that's been done in conflict minerals is, even though you had Dodd-Frank, for example, that mandates U.S. corporations have to report on where their minerals originate and under what conditions are they mined, there has been a trickle down throughout the whole supply chain globally for a variety of actors, including the smelters, to take action. We're also seeing that although the original guidance came out of the OECD in Paris, that China has adopted a due diligence approach to support that international guidance. And so we see similar happening with spinning mills. The way we'll most likely approach it is looking at maybe where some of the higher risk spinning mills are located, as well as looking at where they're sourcing from. Because cotton is an internationally traded commodity, you know, we've seen, and in our conversations in our field research, that spinners do purchase from quite a large variety of locations. And so there, the location of the spinning mill, you know, may or may not be as important. I think all mills are going to have to start learning more about where the cotton originates and under what conditions was it harvested.
Okay, our next question is, YESS planning to involve the auditing certification work that brands and retailers could require suppliers? Or is YESS just laying out the suggested guidelines that due diligence efforts should include?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead, Liz?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can just speak to how the conflict minerals works and where YESS is in relation to that. Right now, yes, we, as Patricia mentioned, we are very focused on producing a standard based on the industry's practices and normal in documentation that is routinely used in a day-to-day basis. We do not want to recreate their industry efforts. We want to build off of what is existing in a normal course of business. With that said, we do anticipate that this would evolve and into a program that would be managed and offer audits against the standard. And there is a lot of effort. In fact, I'm currently working on developing the audit tools and trainings and other resources, not only to train auditors, but also to train the spinners. Oftentimes, I mean, really, we wanted to give them both the same information and be quite transparent about expectations. Patricia may want to chime in here, but at this point in time, we don't have a secretariat that is prepared to implement the audit program on a global scale across different regions. As Patricia mentioned, we are developing the standard and plan to pilot it. During this time, we will have conversations about how this could become a global program that would benefit all brands supplying from those spinners, because again, the goal is just to have one audit on behalf of the industry.
Thanks, Liz. I will add something, which is and Liz said, we're not looking to reinvent the wheel. And one of the reasons why I've been quite involved with the Social and Labor Convergence Project is that we're not including the labor conditions of the mills themselves in this in our standard. And the reason why not is because there are a number of great efforts already going on in addition to the SLCP. ETI has been doing a lot of work with spinning mills. We know there's a high risk of labor abuse in the mill itself in India, especially. But there's, we don't want to reinvent the current projects that are going on to address that. What we are looking at, it's materials management and the due diligence there. So that's where we see that our efforts could complement existing audit efforts and working with existing auditing firms. However, doing a due diligence audit, the details Liz went through, is quite different than doing a social or an environmental audit. And so trainings of auditors will have to happen so that they really start to understand the due diligence process and the conversation around management systems and other efforts to be proactively managing and seeing where there's risk and addressing that risk, the prevent, mitigate, all the steps of due diligence that they're incorporating into their own internal systems.
Great, thank you, Patricia. I'll take one last question since we're about 2 minutes into the top of the hour. Just as a reminder to everyone, please enter your questions, and if we haven't gotten to you, Patricia and or Liz will respond and provide you an answer. And be sure to be on the lookout for an email blast from Textile Exchange tomorrow, where we will send this presentation and the video recording. So the last question I'll take is, what would be the cost to spinners for YESS certification? What will be the overall funding model for YESS?
I'll take that, and it's all a bit to be determined. But if we choose, and this is the working group, and what is going to work for the industry, if we follow the conflict minerals model, there would be a cost to spinners for the audit itself. We feel that when they pay for it, they really own it and want the most value out of it. If there's a way to subsidize those initial audits, we'll look into having the funding available to do that. But there's also a lot of need for training, and we're looking to the industry to help cover those expenses. Addressing this as an industry-wide initiative, similar to how the electronics industry and a variety of industries that all use conflict minerals has done it. As long as we're doing it all together, we can help minimize the costs as much as possible. So that's how we're looking to address it in the future.
Okay, fantastic. Well, since it's top of the hour, we will end the webinar. Thank you again for all of those who participated. Thank you, Patricia and Liz, for the excellent presentation. And yes, everyone be on the lookout for that email with more instructions on how you can access today's presentation. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rita.
Okay,
Great.
everyone have a great day.
Thanks to Textile Exchange. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.